Good afternoon. On behalf of the Canadian Jesuits, I'm really happy to welcome you to the first session of our series of webinar, Paths of Wisdom, Time-Tested Practices for Making Meaningful Decisions. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, I'd like to give a few directives for those who would prefer to listen to this presentation in English so that they can follow with simultaneous translation.
To choose the language of your preference, if you're on a computer, in the controls of your meeting or webinar, click on the button Interpretation and click on the language you wish to hear. If you're on a mobile device, in the controls of your meeting or webinar, press the button with the three little dots or plus, and then press Language Interpretation, and then press the language that you wish to hear, in this case, English. Please remember that language interpretation is not available when you access Zoom through a web browser.
So let us continue by recognizing the Indigenous peoples on all the lands where we find ourselves today. Even though we are meeting on a virtual platform, let's take a moment to recognize the importance of the lands that we consider as home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improve relationships between nations and to deepen our own understanding of the Indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from sea to sea, we recognize the ancestral unceded territories on the First Nations, Métis and Inuit, who consider this land as their land. We recognize the injustices and mistakes of the past, and we commit ourselves, each one of us in our own way, to move ahead in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. Today's session, and the same thing for Thursday, will last 90 minutes and will include the presentation and a time for questions. So if you have questions, please use the question and answer box. It's also important to remember that the recordings of each session will be sent to the participants after 3 working days after the presentation. So 3 days, so after Thursday. And now it's my pleasure to introduce, well, she made several presentations, several webinars with us. For those of you who would be joining us for the first time, it's my pleasure to introduce Sister Laurence Loubières, from the Service for Discernment in Common of the Canadian Jesuits. Sister Laurence is Xavier's sister and the director for the Service of Discernment in Common. She has a training in management, counseling, and Ignatian spirituality. She helps religious and other organizations in their decision-making process and strategic planning. She has been working for over 15 years in sustainable and responsible investment. Thank you, Sister Laurence, and welcome. Thank you, Jose, and good afternoon, all. It's a pleasure to join all of you for this first part of our webinars on the decision-making process. So Paths of Wisdom. We'll have a first part today, and the sequel will be on Thursday. So let me share my screen so that we can start this presentation. I hope you're seeing my screen clearly. So that you can follow what I'm presenting. So Paths of Wisdom, Time-Tested Practices for Making Meaningful Decisions, Part 1. As Jose was saying, I'm the director of the Service for Discernment in Common of the Canadian Jesuits province. This was created in 2019, and it's there to help religious communities and apostolates, Jesuits and others in their communal discernment process. So making decisions together to go deeper into their mission. So I'm organizing trainings, workshops, and I'm facilitating this type of processes for different communities who ask me to help them. I'm working on this dimension of discernment in common, meaning a group that's trying to go forward together, but we apply the same tools as for personal discernment, for individual decision making. Today, we will focus on the personal decision making. So, what should I do on a daily basis? So, we realize that our life is a succession of decisions and choices, starting with what we will be wearing as clothes and the way we organize our day, all kinds of decisions about what we will be doing in a few months, in a few years. Our life is filled with decisions about what we choose to live. So decision is about the way to make a good decisions. It's like how to live well, what will be a good decision that will really help me living well. So learning to make decisions in this fashion is a school of life, and that lasts a lifetime. We constantly learn to make decisions, and we constantly exercise ourselves in doing so. But the good news is that the Ignatian spirituality can provide some answers and provides also elements to develop this capacity. So in this first part today, this first webinar, we will see that in order to make decisions, we need to start from a vision. We need to be anchored in a vision, a perspective, because it's the vision that drives the action. And then in a second part, so the next webinar, 2 days from now, we'll go deeper. But today, we will look at the foundations. So the agenda for today, I'll first introduce very briefly St. Ignatius Loyola, who will be our guide and our companion during these 2 webinars. We will get acquainted with him, and all along the process, you'll see that there will be references to what he experienced and the questions he had to deal with as he went along his own life. The originality of Ignatius was becoming aware of this experience and realizing that this could be helpful for others, that others could find themselves in similar situations. And he really developed a whole way of moving ahead based on his experience, what he had himself identified in his own experience. So after this first introduction on Ignatius Loyola, we'll focus on the question of desire and horizon. So the perspective that will come into play very often unconsciously when we make decisions. At second time, we will see how having a vision, a perspective, drives the action, the decision making. And we will conclude today's meeting with a very simple tool, but a powerful, to find a way of reclaiming our agency and really being able to make decisions about what we are living. And we'll conclude with question and answer period, so you can ask your question in the chat. And between the first and the second part and the second and third part, I'll invite you to take a few moments of reflection to really think about what will have touched you in the presentation, then if you so wish, you can use the chat box to share or what you wish about the reflections that come to you as you listen to this presentation. So there will be some interactive moments when you'll be invited to take notes and share your feelings and your questions. So let's start. Saint Ignatius Loyola, a few words. So he lived in the 16th century, was born in 1491, and he was born in a world that was radically changing, moving from the Middle Ages to Renaissance. And there were all kinds of new trends, the discovery of the New World. So Christopher Columbus came to America in 1492. It was the age of Reformation in the church. This was when the printing press was introduced. Time of humanism, there were major social upheavals and wars. So a world was changing, somewhat like what we are experiencing currently in our own world, with rapid changes in all kinds of directions. And Saint Ignatius Loyola was the youngest son of a Basque nobleman. So it's a province of Spain, the Basque country, so northwestern part of Spain. He grew in a noble family and was trained at the court of King Ferdinand of Spain, and he was dreaming of becoming a famous knight and be covered in glories. But we saw that he went to a crisis that gave a completely different orientation to his life. So all along his life, and this is something that we will go deeper into, he realized that his genuine desire in life would be to help others, helping souls, that he says, by offering a vision and tools drawn from his personal experience to help people turn to God and follow a path that will make them happy. So this vision from early in his life was to help people to find a method of decision making to live out this call in a concrete way. So starting exactly from their situation and then entering a path that will help them to realize what's really important and meaningful for them. So we'll study the journey of this man that changed his way of understanding his own life. And through this shift, he discovered a tool to help others live a similar shift and take a different orientation in their lives. We will often refer to what is called the spiritual exercises. This is Ignatius started his experience with a series of spiritual exercises. So it's like a retreat journey. So for people who want to discover their fundamental call. So Ignatius distilled the wisdom accumulated over his personal experience and is accompanying several other people in this small booklet that's called the Spiritual Exercises. It's not really a book that you read. It's more like a tool and a guide for people who give retreats to help the retreatants, those who are doing the retreats, to find their way and discover the call for their lives, and also to take a distance from what is preventing them from following this call. So first, we'll look at this question of desire and horizon, in which we set ourselves to make a decision, and the importance of this horizon. So to come back to Ignatius and his life, in the beginning, he was this young gentleman who was dreaming of glory and having a great military career and being recognized. But he went to a battle in Pamplona. He was 26 years old at the time, and he was wounded at the leg, and a serious wound. So a cannonball broke his knee. So so for several months he was paralyzed. So he had to undergo convalescence to heal his leg. So he had to spend several months in the family castle in Loyola, waiting patiently. So he underwent 2 surgeries and had to wait for his leg to heal, but he will never fully recover. He will always have a problem walking with his leg. But this knee, of course, troubled his dreams of becoming a great knight. He realized that his career was now impossible, that he would not be able to continue as though never would have happened. So he finds himself in a place, in a state of a crisis. He's really wondering what's going to happen to him. And very often we ourselves, we find ourselves in a situation where we need to wonder how we can move ahead. The situations may have changed. We may be confronted with new situations. We may experience some frustration about what we are experiencing. We ask questions about our future. We have choices to make. We don't know exactly how. So these circumstances may lead us to make major or smaller decisions, but it's an opportunity to stop and take stock before we move ahead. So we find ourselves in a similar situation with Ignatius's when we find ourselves in these situations. We could say also that our world finds itself in a crisis. Wars all across the planet, the refugee crisis, so people need to flee authoritarian regimes or poor economic conditions or difficult situations caused by climatic change. The weather changes. We feel that the planet is in dire need of a new model, of a new vision to be able to continue living and growing, but on a new basis, healthier basis. So we are in need of a new direction, and this takes the form of the need of a new vision to be able to make choices. And I include a quote from the book of Proverbs, the Bible. When the people has no vision, they perish. So when people don't know where they're going, they are simply dying on sight. So we really need a vision to understand how to orient our lives. So coming back to Ignatius on his bed and wondering what he would be able to do afterwards and what would happen to him. So he, in his autobiography, Ignatius explains that during that time he was daydreaming, he didn't have much to do, and he was contemplating different kinds of projects. So he had been given books to read. Those were the lives of the saints, or also books on Christ. He asked for chivalry romances, but they couldn't find any. So he was dreaming about going back to his previous life and continuing in some fashion to be a knight. And he was dreaming of realizing major exploits for a lady. So to call her attention, he would do extraordinary things and great feats so that this lady would fall in love with him. So he was dreaming of this special relationship with that woman whom he would impress. And alternately, he was imagining that he might imitate the lives of the saints so that he would be serving God, finding ways of serving God, and doing things that St. Francis or St. Dominic had been doing. So he thought about what he was doing if he were to follow this other way, starting to serve God. And he started to realize, and this is the major discovery that he had, that these two ways of dreaming had different impacts on him, different influence on he had different emotions as he was dreaming about those different ways of living. And this is the major contribution of Ignatius, and really a basic foundation of Ignatian spirituality is about realizing the difference between these different perspectives. So if he were to take his previous life again and looking for personal glory, trying to impress that lady by extraordinary knightly feats, that gave him some kind of joy, but this joy stopped soon and felt sort of thin. It was a perspective that was somewhat attractive, but the attraction did not last. So somewhat like what you're eating something good. So on the spot, you like it, but after a moment, the feeling passes and you move to something else. But conversely, when he was thinking about putting himself in God's service and following a different path, trying to listen to the Lord, then he felt a deeper joy that would last much longer, a richer kind of joy that was grasping the whole of him, and that did not disappear in a matter of minutes. So that joy left him in a state of enthusiasm and energy that was lasting. So he focused on this difference, the contrast between both sets of experiences that he had felt. And so he realized that by comparing these two perspectives, this corresponded to a different way of understanding the meaning of his life and his place in the world. By focusing on the desire to serve God, well, he felt a lasting peace. And when he was thinking about serving his own career and being recognized by the others, he realized that this other joy was much more ephemeral. So for him, a new way opens from this point. He realizes that there's a link between this perspective that would energize him in a lasting way, and a link also between the other perspective and the way that is not lead to the realization of his deep personal vocation. So he suspects that the way is opening before him, following this way to God that would lead him to a more genuine version of who he is. And so he starts to identify what's really energizing him in a lasting fashion. So an exercise that you could be doing, so you could take a moment to think about it, but could ask the Lord to show you. At times it is easier to ask the Lord to show us because we don't know how to really identify those things. So let's ask the Lord, what gives me a lasting happiness? What's in my heart? So what am I truly longing for myself, for my life? What is truly worthwhile for me? And what are the most essential values for me? So take a few moments to think about it. So take a moment to think about it. And after the webinar, you could also come back to these questions. So Ignatius discovers little by little, starting from this difference, this contrast, he becomes aware of the importance of the perspective. And so much so that he makes it a fundamental element of this booklet of the spiritual exercises. That's a text that's called the Principle and Foundation. It's the beginning of the exercises. And Ignatius explains that the human beings are created to praise, revere, and serve the Lord, and thereby save their souls. Then, of course, he has a few comments, but what's interesting for us at this point is really this expression, are created to. So the human life has a fundamental orientation. We are created in order to praise, revere, and serve the Lord. This foundational element is that our life comes from God and is finding its accomplishment in God. Our life has a basic meaning, a deep call that allows us to find our place in the whole of creation. And hence the invitation to really discover and feel this fundamental grace, fundamental blessing that God has put in us. What Ignatius discovered is that everyone has a personal and fundamental call. So for the Christians, it's really owning this grace of baptism that makes us children of God and that invites us to really start from this foundational identity of children of God and discover all the freedom that this implies. And so really taking ownership of our fundamental identity of children of God. And St. Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians is also explaining this same thing of this basic blessing that God is given to each one of us for the well-being of the community. It's something that we receive to share it. So as he says, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it's the same God who activates all of them in every one. So to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. So God is giving us something that comes from God, and that invites us to give for the common good, for the well-being of everyone. That's the sense of our existence.
And at this time, we're looking for perspective in the total world. If you don't know it, I'd invite you to read these two books, two major letters that Pope Francis wrote. The first letter, encyclical Laudato Si, and the first words of a song from St. Francis of Assisi. We praised God for the creation. Laudato Si, I praise you, Lord. Be blessed, Lord. And in that encyclical, he talks about his vision for the life of our earth today. He invites us to take on our role in the planet among all creations, to have a life that's good and in harmony also with the other beings. Talks about the contemporary problems in that letter. And Fratelli Tutti, another encyclical, which talks about the human fraternity and how to really live our relationships together on the planet. So social relationships, Laudato Si, is the relationship to the creation. And of course, Fratelli Tutti has a social dimension. So two books that are encyclicals I invite you to read, and that when you receive the PDF of these slides, you'll be able to read these texts that are also online. I put a few extracts here of these two texts, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. It's a few quotations that shows us where the Pope places us so we can reappropriate this desire of living a simple lifestyle to help out the whole planet, because the issues today are very important. The personal decisions on everything that's happening in the world. So we need to place ourselves within our context. This vision of our life in the middle of the planet and of the creation. So to choose quotations to give our echoes that show us the perspective in which the Pope tries to place ourselves in. It's for us today. For example, the world is more than a problem, but a wonderful mystery that we contemplate, enjoy, and embrace. So we need to see the real world as a gift, a source of awe and joy, becoming aware that this richness we heard the gift of God, and we are invited to thank God mostly before contemplate the world as a problem to solve. There's also an invitation to reach others, see the world as it is, without fear of pain or sense of inadequacy, because there we will discover all the goodness that God has planted in human hearts. Fratelli Tutti. It's to reach the world such as it is, to discover there the love of God. Another perspective also, another dimension, when we can see God reflected in all that exists, our hearts are moved to praise the Lord for all his creatures and to worship him in union with them. When we see this beauty of this world and of creation, that we want to give thanks and praise God for everything that exists. Everything is interconnected, and genuine care for our own lives and our own relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. Our human life is linked to the lives of all the others on this planet, all other persons, and therefore the authentic protection of our life entails the protection of all the others, of those around us, those who are we connected with. Because this is done with inseparable from fraternity, justice, and solidarity. When we seek when we start thinking of the kind of world we're living in, and will leave to other future generations, we start looking at things differently. We realize the world is a gift which we have freely received, and then in turn we must share with others. And also, it is a sentence that says, tenderness is the path of choice for the strongest, for the most courageous men and women. So there's a new life that opens up on us, for us. And also this attention to pain and suffering on the planet. We cannot be indifferent to it. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. Instead, we should feel indignant, challenged to emerge from our comfortable isolation and to be changed by our contact with human suffering. That is the meaning of full dignity. To be aware of the suffering that so many people on this planet experience, and to act in helping to eliminate suffering. So all these elements are there to help us see what is a deep desire of our lives, which is not very different than what is good for all and very good for the planet. We need to build a new world that's good not only for us, but for all the beings, for all the people, for all elements of creation, because everything is interlinked. This hope is not new. This hope for the world is something that runs through the Bible, at the heart of the message. It is for Israel, for example, of the Jewish faith and Christian faith. I put two extracts from two prophets that are in the Bible, thousands of years, 1,000 years before Christ, where the people were invited to place their hope in God, and knowing that God will be be there with them to help out. So this is the prophecies from Isaiah, who shows the wolf will be with the lamb, the leopard will be with the goats, and the little boy will lead them. And there will be no evil on all my land. The knowledge of the Lord will be in the whole country. And it's a Jopin, but this is what motivated and it allows us to have a good life, not only for ourselves, but for all. And also the Ezekiel's prophecy, where he says he's going to take the nations, bring them a heart of flesh, get rid of the heart of stone. He'll place his spirit within you, make you follow my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances. I will make the fruit of the tree and the produce of the field abundant, so that you may never suffer a disgrace of famine among the nations. So this is a hope that's throughout the Bible. It's there for our faith. It gives us a perspective to a life that allows us to proceed with confidence that God's at our side to build this world, to bring about this world. And here is a contemporary expression in this vision from an author, Charles Eisenstein, who presents himself as a Christian, but he works with Jewish people. So in his work, which is called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, in that book, he says, the world is possible. He says that what we want is to move from a society of domination to one of participation, from conquest to co-creation, from extraction to regeneration, from harm to healing, and from separation to love. And we want to enact this transition in all our relations, be they ecological, economic, political, and personal. That is why we can say the revolution is love. Our way of talking about this hope that we see a good world It's a new model, a new way of living on this planet, where everybody should be able to live together in a dignity. So we are created for, our life is really an orientation, basic orientation. And the horizon we think about is, it will really touch how we act in each day. And so Ignatius had thought about a horizon, and he proposes this to all people he's helping out. And through his spirituality, he says, each person sees that we are created to give ourselves to something greater than ourselves. That is true, good and love, and good and just. To give who we are out of love freely, to contribute to building the world that makes sense for all. It's a personal vocation, but it's for the good of all. The importance to place ourselves in that orientation and that fundamental vision. So I'm going to take you a little bit of time now. Take 2 minutes to reflect on these questions. What touched me the most in this section? And what do I retain as the main takeaway? If you wish, you can write down a few words in the chat so we can see what you want to share. So I'm just saying we cannot be indifferent to the suffering of the world. To have a new idea for humanity and for us personally, to hope to go on from domination to participation. Its importance given to the perspective that should harmonize all our values, our deep values together. We start with an idea or a vision, and with a vision, and ultimately that vision includes us and the whole world. The Spirit has been given to the common good, as St. Paul says. The values that somebody, a question we ask the Lord, what motivates me the most is we are created to give something greater than ourselves. What is good for all creation and powerful? So what is good for me, as I said, is good for all creation. See the creation as a gift, which gives us joy to go from domination to participation. Suffering is inevitable, and we need to find a bigger meaning for suffering. And that greater meaning is God. Thank you very much for these ideas, these contributions. Reach others. Find the world as it is. Seek the joy that lasts. Thank you very much for these responses. You can see the importance of having a basic perspective that allows us to act and to guide us. So we're going to continue our process. We're going to continue with the second section and see how the vision itself drives the action. So how does the vision drive the action, or how does the action come out of the vision? I have another quotation here from Charles Eckenstein. I've translated it in French on the bottom part. You'll have the text in French and English on the other slides, however. When we look at the French text, the translation, he says, when we align our lives on a service objective or goal, the things that we do flow exceptionally in a courageous way in the eyes of others. When we see that the world is abundant, the acts of generosity are easy because it's quite clear that we can continue to receive something. When we see others as a reflection of ourselves, forgiveness becomes of second nature because we see that through the grace of God, I am in the same boat. When we appreciate order, the beauty, the mystery, and interconnection of the whole universe, we feel a deep joy and a deep happiness that nothing can shake. When we see that the time is abundant and life is infinite, we develop a huge superhuman patience. When we abandon a vision of our lives as distinct and separated from others, amazing capacities, intuitive capacities and perspectives appear and can last a whole life. So the role of this, he puts the perspective in the action that we undertake. We have to have, our acts are all part of, guided by and driven by a vision. And we have the text of the Beatitudes in the Bible that we are created in order to be able to give ourselves and to be generous with ourselves. And what Ignatian will say, he'll repeat in his spiritual exercises, is that love is shown in deeds. In this vision, this desire to love becomes an act, and it becomes a decision. And a team of Jesuits worked on the questions of common discernment in the 80s and 90s. They said making decisions is the single most important act or action that an individual or group ever does, because love is a decision, not an emotion. And we love through our decisions. So through our decisions and our actions, we become a true and authentic version of the persons we're called to be. It's really through our freedoms of choice and our decisions, and our actions reflect our values. Our life embodies the vision that sustains us deeply. So you can see how the decision making will help deeply touch us, and that's why we need to be anchored deeply into what we want to be able to embody this and through decisions. Here we find the path with Ignatian, the way of living his life. As an insight of an appreciation for ourselves, Ignatius, after his conversion and the experience of contrast between these different perspectives, he started to grow in the road by following foot by foot. It took many years, following in the footsteps what he felt as a joyful situation for his own life, and we followed a new pathway. He left his home in 1522 after having found the capacity to walk, and there are different steps. He sees that the Lord is allowing him to choose progressively his fundamental call for himself. So he'll have all kinds of trips, and I put these maps here where you can see all the trips that Ignatius walked on foot or by boat. He thought going in Holy Lands, and finally his plans were changed. And through all these events, he started listening more and more to this fundamental call which has appeared in him, the call to help the souls. And in 1524, back from the Holy Land, he asked himself, He asked himself, here, becoming aware of helping people is a deep call for him, given to him by the Lord, and you see, to do it well, he'll have to study to be competent and to be able to know what should I do. And so he'll commit himself in a series of decisions and events that will lead him always forth in faithfulness to the faith. Is his fundamental call to help the souls. And this we'll see step by step in all kinds of circumstances. Eventually will bring him to set up the Congregation of the Jesuits on 1540, setting a Company of Jesus, and it'll be occasions to fulfill his deep call and to choose the consequences. And what is interesting to see how this personal call, received in 1524 to help out the souls, and everything that followed in the constitutions of the Congregation of the Jesuits that he founded back later. We find there the heart of the vocation of the Jesuits is really to help the souls. So there's this dimension that we find there, which will be like a red thread, and it will be found even in the constitutions of the Jesuits. And when we reflect, and we see that on following this way of proceeding, seeking what attunes us to God's desire by taking decisions that bring us closer to our thrust and our vision, what we're doing is that we're trying to attune ourselves to God, what God wants. God wants our hope, or God wants our happiness. God wants us to become what we are and to be deeply. So there's a grace that God puts into us. And this quest, this research becomes one of coherence or consistency to see who we are, what we do, and the way in which we do it. In a way to be consistent, to see the who, the what, and the how in our lives, because all this is linked. When we look at the Christ in the Gospels, we see that Christ is the one who lives out perfectly is this consistency. He lives it perfectly. His identity as Son of God is manifested in his whole life, in all his actions, his words, and everything he does, and a way of doing things. And Jesus shows himself as Son of God, and he is truly the incarnate love of God. Growing, he is the incarnate one. And so for us also, the issue is to grow or not in us the truth of our life, who we are, through the truth in our life. So by choosing and constantly choosing which is good for us, what this will produce is that our life itself will become more and more true and good, and finally good for others also. So it will be important for others. So in doing this quest for truth for us, it does it also for others. Others see who we are, and we can give the grace that God has put in us. Now, there's a tool that can help us here, a way of proceeding anyway, that for me allows me to see how this is to be worked out, this scale of values from established by Bernard Lonergan, who showed that how there are different levels of values that allow us to see where things are happening. So you can see on this chart, on the bottom of it, the scale of the chart, at the bottom is everything that we would call vital. Everything is vital: health, food, sleep, all the vital functions that we need to operate. Then in our life, there's a social dimension, which is the question of relations, work, study, and relationships, family, friends. the communities that we're part of, all the organizations that we're part of, society, the different groups that we're part of. Then there's a cultural level, third at the bottom, which is the way into living out our relationships. So all the values there, often unconscious, that will determine our way of seeing things and to act. Usually this is called culture. And you see that when you travel, people will do things. You find out that people do things differently, eating differently, for example, dressing differently, or sense of humor differently, ways of doing things differently. And that's the reflect of our culture, of the cultural values. We don't always talk about this, but it's in us. And this determines how we do things. And then we have the personal level, really specific to us, where we can make the choices and decisions. That's where our freedom, inner freedom applies. And the religious level, up high beyond that, the grace, where we find ourselves identified as children of God, with what is which is the deepest in us, which is our gravity center of gravity, where our identity concentrates itself. And the issue that we talked about previously concerning decisions and choices to make, the issue for us is to find a way of making coherent all these different levels, to see how my identity as a child of God expresses itself through my choices, my decisions, and it will be inspired by my values, and the way in which how we see things and what becomes important for us. So all this translates in a weighing of living out our work, our relationships in society, which is in conformity with this basic identity as a child of God, and will have impact on our health, our food, and our sleep, with the need of taking care of these dimensions in order to be able to live out well the relationships, to have values that are truly what we want, and to reach that level of decision making where we can incarnate the identity of the children of God, which means that in fact all our work will be in looking at these different fields, these different groups, what helps me to live out what I want to live out deeply, which is my identity as child of God, in order to love and to do something greater than myself, and to see how all this will be part of my decisions and choices and the values I adopt in my relationships, in my way of living, my health, with my food, and even sleep. What's interesting here is in this scale or this ladder is to see if there's anything that's not aligned properly. And the way of correcting it is to have the next level up to look at it. If I see that I don't have enough sleep, I'm always tired, etc., I might have to change something at the social level in terms of the way in which I use my time in my day. Find a way of adjusting the schedule of my day in order to have the sleep that I need. Here, and if I notice that socially, I'm always working, but I don't have time for friends or for family anymore. Maybe at the cultural leave, I become aware that I put too much influence in my work. Maybe there has to be other values that I need to consider in terms of the relationships, gratuitousness, the way of living, my leisure time. Maybe that needs to be looked at and needs to be readjusted in that way. And all of this, I do this thanks to my choices and decisions I want to take, exercising my freedom, which is personal, that God gives me in order to live the awareness and to see what I want to live. You see that how this ladder allows to have different levels there where we can act and understand what's happening, and to come back to seek in permanency the alignment, this coherence, that allows us to incarnate in our choices, the vision that our names.
So the good news in all of that is that we are not alone to live this project of giving some consistency to our lives. God meets us where we are. God meets us in our efforts to give some orientation to our lives, and he does so through various means, through prayer, through scripture, reading the Bible, listening to the Word of God. God meets us in the sacraments, in the Mass, and also in the relationships that we have through the others, in all that happens to us. This is also, well, maybe not a discovery, but let's say that Ignatius really helped to explain this, making us understand that God really reaches us through all that is part of our lives. And what Ignatius says is that God is at work through all of the creation, through all his creatures, in all people, in all circumstances, in all events. And our work is to align our desires and decisions with the direction indicated by the Spirit, opening ourselves to this work of God in us and through all the creation. So aligning our will, our decisions on what the Spirit is showing us. We are not alone in this orientation effort. God meets us and helps us to open ourselves to follow the right direction, to become collaborators with God and becoming who we are in truth. So it's really the work of God to help us grow and bear fruit for the good of all. Another element coming from the spiritual exercises, it's the prayer that Ignatius invites the person who does the exercises to recite every day, each one of the 30 days. So may all my intentions, actions, operations be purely ordered to your praise, your service, your glory. So may all my life, all that I do, be ordered to what you want for me, the service of God and service of the others that makes us happy. So second short break, short time to give you an opportunity to think about what touched you in this second part of the presentation. And again, if you want to share something in the chat box, feel comfortable to do so. The idea of consistency at all levels, yes. Ignatius' prayer. How is my life aligned with this deep identity of child of God? Love is a decision. It's intervening at the superior level, becoming God's collaborator. Maybe a question about how Ignatius received this call. Very often, our career decisions are based on some pragmatic aspect than on an ideal. So I think it's possible to correct this scale of values. Yes, bearing fruit for the good of all and not only for myself. Love is a decision. We love through our decisions, aligning my life with God's grace, always incarnating better the interior call. Identify what helps me to live in depth. And thank you for your contributions, and let us continue our journey. So reclaiming our agency to choose and act. So finding a place where it's possible to choose and act. So it's the first exercise that you could do personally. So I simply gave you the text of the principle and foundation from the spiritual exercises so that we can continue to deepen Ignatius's thought and see the consistency in all of that. As I told you, Ignatius starts this number in the exercises by saying God created human beings to praise, reverence, and revere and serve God. And the other things on the face of the earth are there to help fulfill this purpose. So it follows that we're used to things of this world only to the extent that they help us to this end. So we ought to rid ourselves of the things that prevent us from doing so. So this is the suggestion of Ignatius, that the human being should constantly be thinking about the way that he's using the things at his or her disposal, using them in as much as they're helping him or her, and letting go of them, ridding ourselves of the things to the extent that they get in the way of our ends. So it's an exercise about identifying what's really helpful. And you remember that at the beginning of his own spiritual journey, Ignatius had this experience of identifying what was really helping him, what was bringing a lasting joy, and what was only short-lived. So we want to make ourselves attentive to the differences in our own heart, what's happening in our heart. And so to start the journey, to a sure method is to be anchored in gratefulness or gratitude. In the Christian perspective, we know that we receive our life from God, for God and for the others. And the perspective that Pope Francis is developing in Laudato Si and his other writings, we are receiving the world and the others as gifts. All that we are living, all that we're having and receiving are gifts. And so the road to gratitude is putting us on the right track, opening us, making us able to be in awe in front of the gifts that we are receiving. So we start to follow the path that leads us to a good place and helps us to be one with who we really are. Starting in this way, and then you could do a daily exercise of orienting myself in my life and looking at where I am, identifying what puts me in gratitude and what does not help me to do so. An exercise that you could do at the end of the day. So ask the Lord to show you for what moment am I most grateful today, and for what moment today am I least grateful. And another way to explain this attitude, or so I suggest other ways of asking the same question. When I did give and receive the most today, when I did give and receive the least today, when was I happiest today or saddest? When did I feel most alive today? When did I feel like life draining out of me? What was my high point, my low point? When today did I have the greatest sense of belonging to myself, others, God, and the universe? Or when did I have the least sense of belonging? So different ways of asking the same question about gratitude and thanksgiving. So it's always this exercise about identifying the contrast, the difference. So we open ourselves to the action of the Spirit, who will really show us that for which we're feeling most grateful or least grateful. So rely on God. God will show you. Don't try and simply find it by yourself. Ask God to help you identify what really helps you. So this is an exercise that you could do daily, and you'll see that after some time you'll identify a way, a path that will help you to identify elements that keep coming back and that will draw your attention on your deep call, what God intends to tell you through what you are experiencing day after day. So you have the same questions also in English, so you'll find it when you receive the PowerPoint presentation in a few days. So note and write down day by day what you have received. And at the end of each week, read your notes, what you have been writing day after day, and you'll see that certain things are coming back again and again. And they have to do with what is deeply motivating you and what seems to be more difficult, or those things for which you're less grateful. And so you'll see trends taking shape, and you'll understand better deeper perspectives taking shape in your lives. So in conclusion for this presentation, making good decisions imply that we choose according to a deep desire, a deep calling. We want to reconnect with this deep vision in our hearts. And this also requires that we can make a distinction between what is really energizing us on a steadfast fashion and what seems to be only short-lived. So it's something that we should get rid of or take a distance from. So this work about making distinctions, this is discernment, sifting. And so making decisions in such a perspective, it's less about solving problems or trying to solve problems, but letting ourselves guide by the Spirit that's leading us regularly. It's not about resolving things, but letting ourselves be inspired and guided in order to follow a path that is taking shape before us, and that's really expressing our practical life. And that's what we will be deepening, this way of understanding this orientation by going deeper into this contrast and this way of making a distinction between these forces that are at work in our hearts. So in the next webinar, we will deepen this section. So I will invite you to come back for the next webinar to know more about it. So question to conclude this, what touched you the most in the presentation today? What is the main takeaway for you? And again, you're invited to share in the chat box.
Donc, dans le chat, je vois des questions sur ces diapositives. Oui, la version anglaise existe et vous aurez la version anglaise, bien sûr. Voilà, être ancré dans la gratitude. Voilà, relire ses notes à la fin de la semaine. Oui, la prière de l'examen. Cette manière de relire cette journée en cherchant ce qui me dynamise ou au contraire ce qui m'a moins dynamisé, on l'appelle examen aussi. Voilà. Ce terme de contraste pour repérer, comme un fusain ou une photo, ce qui se dessine, effectivement. Créer de l'espace pour un discernement, effectivement. On est créé pour louer, respecter, servir, pour sauver les âmes. Oui. Donc cette vie de Saint Ignace et tous les enseignements spirituels qu'on peut tirer de sa vie. Faire des examens de conscience, effectivement. Travailler, être en accord avec son appel profond. Voilà, nous ne sommes pas maîtres de tous. Commencer par la gratitude. Ouais. Voilà. Alors, je vous invite aussi à poser des questions et puis on va prendre un petit temps de questions maintenant. Donc, Rosée, n'hésite pas à relayer des questions. Merci.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Sœur Laurence. Je pense que cette présentation s'adresse au bon nombre d'entre nous et nous touche. Il est temps maintenant, comme Sœur Laurence a dit, de répondre à quelques questions. N'oubliez pas que vous pouvez poser vos questions dans la boîte questions et réponses, pas dans la boîte conversation. Et on a déjà quelques questions dans la liste. Yves demande, il est parfois difficile de tout laisser tomber pour aller vers une nouvelle orientation professionnelle. La peur de se tromper. Comment en être convaincu?
Alors, effectivement, ça peut être impressionnant de tout laisser tomber, mais avant de prendre une décision radicale comme ça, il faut commencer par repérer vraiment si c'est la bonne direction, donc y aller progressivement en fait. Et donc commencer à repérer en faisant ces petits exercices quotidiens sur voilà, qu'est-ce qui me donne le plus d'énergie, qu'est-ce qui me met le plus dans la gratitude, ce pourquoi je rends le plus grâce, etc., etc. Et souvent, pour des décisions très importantes, c'est aussi bien de se faire accompagner, c'est-à-dire de pouvoir parler avec quelqu'un qui est expérimenté en matière de direction spirituelle, d'accompagnement spirituel, pour pouvoir justement sentir si la décision qu'on prend va être bonne ou pas, ou si on exagère, ou si c'est approprié, etc. Donc, c'est bien aussi de se faire conseiller. Mais dans le webinaire qui suit, on va aller aussi un petit peu plus loin sur la manière de discerner comment les choses se passent en nous et quels peuvent être un outil pour justement poser les choses et sentir quand on a une décision importante à prendre, comment faire cette décision. Donc la suite à la prochaine étape.
On a mis aussi dans le chat les liens vers le centre de spiritualité et de retraite des Jésuites au Canada. Donc, vous pouvez trouver plus de ressources par rapport à la spiritualité ignatienne et beaucoup de ce dont Sœur Laurence a parlé aujourd'hui. Donc, une autre question. Comment peut-on prendre une décision sur une telle ou telle chose sans pouvoir laisser son chemin?
Alors, je ne suis pas sûre d'avoir complètement compris. Comment peut-on prendre une décision sur telle ou telle chose sans pouvoir laisser son chemin? En fait, quand on prend des décisions de cette manière-là, on continue sur notre propre chemin. En fait, on cherche un chemin de cohérence et de vie. Et du coup, les décisions deviennent des manières d'être de plus en plus en cohérence avec ce qu'on cherche, en fait. Donc, toutes les occasions de prendre des décisions deviennent des occasions d'inscrire une forme de cohérence dans notre vie.
Et quelqu'un a demandé s'il y aura de la traduction vers l'anglais. Oui, elle est déjà disponible dans la session sur les boutons interprétation, mais on partagera aussi les enregistrements des sessions dans chaque langue. Donc, ça sera disponible dans 3 jours ouvrables après la session. Une autre question, quelqu'un demande si Bernard Lonergan a écrit un livre sur les sujets. Sur les sujets de l'échelle des valeurs.
Non, en fait, il n'a pas écrit de livre du tout. Il a écrit, cette mention se trouve dans un ouvrage qui s'appelle Method in Theology, donc méthode en théologie, mais c'est un passage très court dans l'Onergan. Donc j'ai développé un petit peu sa pensée en élargissant un petit peu ses dimensions. Donc pour l'instant, vous ne trouverez pas ça dans un ouvrage en particulier, mais l'Onergan a écrit des choses sur l'échelle des valeurs dans cet ouvrage Method in Theology. Donc, vous pouvez chercher, mais il n'y a pas vraiment d'ouvrage en tant que tel qui va vous décrire les choses comme je les décris, en fait.
Est-ce qu'il y aura des livres qui s'inspirent par les mêmes modèles éthiques ou...
En fait, il y a beaucoup d'ouvrages de spiritualité ignatienne qui reviennent à cette question de la perspective de fond, à cette question du mouvement des esprits en nous, qu'on va voir plus en détail pour dans la prochaine rencontre, mais il y a beaucoup d'ouvrages de spiritualité ignatienne sur lesquels vous pouvez vous reporter pour aller plus loin ou retravailler ces questions, bien sûr.
OK. Une autre question. Comment savoir ce qu'on veut est en accord avec le plan de Dieu?
Vous le sentez. En fait, ce que j'ai essayé de montrer dans la présentation, c'est qu'on le sent, en fait. Cet accord avec le plan de Dieu, on va le sentir par une forme de joie profonde qui dure. On va le sentir par une forme d'énergie, on va le sentir par une forme de goût, de vivre. Donc ça, c'est des signes qu'on est sur la bonne piste.
OK. Quelqu'un demande un peu dans le sens de la première question. Cette vision du monde de bonté, de charité, d'espoir peut sembler écrasante. Nous pouvons avoir l'impression que nos vies ne sont pas vraiment alignées sur cette vision. Nous pouvons peut-être nous sentir découragés. Comment ne pas se sentir dépassé ou écrasé? Est-ce que nous sommes appelés à être compatissants envers nous-mêmes ou comment
Oui, tout à fait.
approcher ce type de sentiment?
Mais c'est effectivement dans le monde, c'est parfois difficile de garder l'espoir, de garder l'espérance ou d'avoir le sentiment qu'on peut faire quelque chose. Mais on peut se rendre compte qu'en fait, dans chaque circonstance, on peut revenir à cette orientation de notre cœur sur qu'est-ce que je désire profondément en fait. Et du coup, dans cette circonstance, quel est le petit pas que je peux faire moi, à mon niveau, et qui va être en cohérence avec ce que je fais. Et comme on va le voir aussi beaucoup dans la deuxième partie, mais tous nos actes sont connectés les uns aux autres. Et moi, je peux faire une petite partie, je peux poser un petit pas, mais ça peut avoir des conséquences sur plein d'autres choses par la suite, en fait. Donc, sentir que qui que nous sommes, on a un impact sur notre propre vie et sur la vie du reste du monde, d'une manière ou d'une autre. Même par les toutes petites choses qu'on peut faire. Et ça peut même être simplement une attitude intérieure de choisir de continuer d'espérer, de choisir de continuer à croire qu'on peut s'engager pour le bien enfin, voilà, et chercher à le vivre et chercher à le faire. Avoir le désir et se réancrer dans le désir, c'est déjà un acte conscient qui nous met au bon endroit et qui va pouvoir nous aider à agir de cette manière, en fait.
Some people are saying that the translation into English is not working. Certains d'entre vous nous disent que l'interprétation vers l'anglais ne marche pas. Est-ce que c'est le cas? Est-ce que vous pouvez nous faire savoir?
It's working now. Somehow or other it went off. The interpreter turned it on and it should have continued on. I don't know why it turned off.
Oui, Yes, I'm here, so we can continue. I can continue.
Okay, parfait.
It's working now. Well, thanks for letting us know about this. It's not normal to be muted. Another question? When will be the next session? Next session will be this Thursday at noon, and use the same link as you have today. And the recordings are going to be sent also for the second session. The two recordings will be sent together after the second session, 3 days after the second session. What resources do people have? What resources can people consult? What would be your recommendations? Was a book written by a sister, Allow Yourselves to be Led by the Spirit. Very simple. And that picks up a lot of things that we said today and the things that I will pick up next week. Her name is Monique Leroy. It's published in French only at this time in Vie Chrétienne, Christian Lives in France. I'll send a link later on. A lot of things, if you look for spirituality, Ignatian spirituality in English, you'll get, if you look it up on the Google, you'll find a lot of articles. Learning to Pray, a guide for everyone also. It's very accessible, and it covers what Sister Laurence described, at least a part of what she described today, what she will be dealing with next week. In 2 days. In 2 days. Yes. So, thank you, Sister Laurence, for your content today. Thank you to our interpreters, Albert Baudry and Michel Côté, for their work. Don't forget to come back Thursday at noon for the second session of this series. We'll look at practical tools to be able to take good decisions, make good decisions. And you remember, we have the instruments will be, you can receive the recording 3 days later, and don't forget to fill in the survey at the end of the session. We hope that will help us out in our work. So thank you very much. See you next Thursday.